Hello, hello, hello. Bonsoir tout le monde. Thank you for joining us. You are here with the Haitian Women's Alliance, and we have a very special program planned for you today. We are having a panel of dynamic Haitian women, and in honor of Women's History Month, we are discussing Black women and mental health. And more specifically, we are talking about mental health in the Haitian community. So, this is a conversation that is not to be missed. This is a conversation that will get very real, very personal, because these are topics that we don't often talk about in the Black community, and we certainly don't often talk about them in the Haitian community. So I want all of you who are within the sound of my voice right now to tag your friends. Go in the comments where you're watching us live. We are live on YouTube and also on Facebook. So if you're watching us there, be sure to tag your friends in the comments, tag anyone who you feel like needs to hear this conversation. I mean, call them, DM them, WhatsApp them, do what you got to do, but make sure they are here. Because as I always say, whenever we have one of these talks, upakapala, you cannot not be here. So make sure that we have a good crowd of people who are joining us as well, because we are going to talk about some important things in our community and things that more than ever before at a time like this, we are living in unprecedented times. These are things that we really need to talk about and discuss because they are real and they are affecting our lives. But before we do that, and to give you a chance to get more people on board, I want to tell you a little bit about the Haitian Women's Alliance. So in 2018, a pioneering group of Haitian women felt the need to form a professional women's organization in order to share ideas, resources, and network opportunities within the Haitian community. We banded together to form the Haitian Women's Alliance. HWA is a professional organization dedicated to building a community of women across all sectors to expand networks, educate, and celebrate accomplishments. We accomplish this by developing programs and events that stimulate personal and professional growth and leadership capabilities. And our purpose is to promote leadership and professional development, to provide opportunities for women to expand their networks and circle of influence, and to inspire women to achieve and to share their success stories, and to nurture future leaders by providing academic scholarship. So this is what we are all about. And part of all of that we do is having talks like this so that we can touch people to inform and to better the lives of Black women, Haitian women, and women everywhere. And so without further ado, I would like to bring in my panel of amazing, lovely Haitian women. Bam, there we are, all on one screen. Thank you, ladies, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Marley.
Thank you.
Delighted to be here.
And these women, let me tell you, are so accomplished. So I cannot continue with this program before giving all of these women a proper introduction and letting you know what they are all about. So we are going to start with you, Charlene, if you don't mind. So Charlene Erivo is a media, marketing, and communications professional. In her expansive career, Erivo has hosted on cable television, collaborated with independent media companies, and navigated world-known conglomerates such as Forbes, CBS News, NBC Universal, and Harvard University. She is currently a marketing manager at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, where she leads strategy for creative content and communications, as well as for flagship events such as the Pinnacle Awards. Charlene, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And next we have Dr. Yves Salomon Fernandez, who is a nationally recognized leader who serves as Senior Vice President for Operations Planning at Southern New Hampshire University, the largest online university in the United States. She previously served as president of Greenfield Community College in Massachusetts and Cumberland County College in New Jersey. Dr. Salomon Fernandez serves on the board of Cooley Dickinson Hospital and as corporator for Greenfield Cooperative Bank. Eve is also a former member of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's Community Development Advisory Council. She is the proud mom of two teenagers who both stand taller than her. if you can believe that. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Eve. A pleasure to have you. And then we have Mildred Antenor. She is an author, social commentator, and educator. Her book, The Gladioli Are Invisible, a memoir, which is available on Amazon, is her personal story of growing up as a first-generation Haitian American born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Mildred has written, edited, and developed stories for publications including the New York Times and the Village Voice. She is a regular commentator on the WBGO Journal on 88.3 FM radio, where her commentaries focus on women's matters. She has appeared on The Maxwell Show on NBC Peacock, giving political commentary. Mildred has also appeared on PBS, The O'Reilly Factor, and WPIX Channel 11 Morning News. Thank you so much for joining us, Mildred.
Thank you for having me, Marley.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Vanessa Prosper. She is a trilingual Canadian native of Haitian descent who grew up in Montreal, Quebec. She currently resides in Boston, Massachusetts, and is a licensed psychologist with over 20 years of clinical experience working in racially and ethnically diverse children populations, as well as adolescents, adults, and families. Dr. Prosper graduated from Boston College's doctoral program in counseling psychology and completed a 2-year school-based clinical postdoctoral fellowship at the Boston Children's Hospital Neighborhood Partnerships Program. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Prosper, and your input will be invaluable in this conversation because you will give us the expert facts that we can bank on and really use to change our lives. So let's start it off with you, Dr. Prosper. Black women and mental health. We are underrated when it comes to levels of depression and other mental illnesses. Tell us some of the statistics in the background as far as that's concerned.
So, yes, so if we're thinking about how Black women are socialized, and more specifically, how Haitian Black women are socialized, let's start there. And mental health stigma in the Haitian community, but also as a Haitian women, even the term in Haitian Creole, like femme c'est potomitan, the women are the rock, the pillars of families, of society. And what that means in terms of how we are brought up as little girls, or the messages that are conveyed and internalized in terms of like, oh, we're supposed to be able to be the emotional anchor of everybody in our family, take care of everybody. It doesn't leave much space for us to actually have emotions, to emote, to break down, to see that, to actually process our feelings and emotions when we're having a difficult time. It's almost like we're not allowed to feel, we're not allowed to have bad days. And the repercussion of that is that a lot of women, especially Haitian women, tend to navigate the world as, okay, I just got to get things happen. And that doesn't leave much space for them to take care of themselves. And that puts them more in a position to be vulnerable to mental health difficulties. So it doesn't mean that I'm not crying, that I'm not showing a facade, we can put on a facade that, okay, we're strong and we're carrying the family and we're taking care of everybody, but it doesn't mean that we're not experiencing sadness. We're not experiencing dissatisfaction. We're not experiencing a high level of stress. And when those are not acknowledged and are not, unpacked, they build up and makes Black women, especially Haitian women, more vulnerable to depression and anxiety. Just in general, women are more vulnerable to depression than men are because of the way that we're socialized, but also a lot, like I said, unexamined emotion, unexamined stress, not being allowed to even externalize these feelings makes us more vulnerable to mental health difficulties.
Right. But let's get real, Dr. Vanessa. I mean, as Black women, as Haitian women, we experience all these things, but I mean, where can we turn to? What do we do? It seems that sometimes when we vocalize these issues, there's a stigma attached to it.
Yes, and especially I'm gonna start with with the Haitian culture, the Haitian community, but also the community at large, where there is this. I was thinking about the different barriers in general for the Black community to access or to even consider mental health providers in terms of getting help for their mental health difficulties. First of all, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of myths. There's a lot of what we call like cultural paranoia that stems from systemic racism, not trusting that the system is really invested in your well-being, because there's been so much history, from centuries ago, in terms of like Black people being misused and represented, but also used for experimental experiments in medicine, and being abused by the system, but also in terms of the racism that is very pervasive in the medical system in terms of misdiagnosis of Black individuals. There is a lot of research showing that like there is like, Black men, for example, are diagnosed with schizophrenia and psychosis at a much higher rate than white men. In terms of Black women, the simple things of like not taking the context and the history into consideration, right? The lack of mental health providers who are culturally competent and taking context into consideration. So, for example, it is very normal for Black people to mistrust the system, to have a lot of doubt about that the system can help them, and that can often be misinterpreted as somebody who's having paranoid delusions, which is one of the symptoms of psychosis. And then they get slapped with the diagnosis of being psychotic or being crazy, and then they get hospitalized when they don't need to, when in reality it's racial trauma, it's PTSD, it's depression, right? And so there's also a lot of chatter in the community about like, no, don't trust these people, misinformation, like I said, like this is that. So there needs to be a lot of education, but also there is a lack of mental health providers who are Black. I think the rate of like psychologists, let's say, who are Black is below 4%, let's say, for example. And then if you add on the layer of the language barrier, there's not a lot of Haitian providers. So there's like the language barrier as well. So all these things contribute to the mental health disparities, like in the Haitian community, if we think about it, but also the hesitation of seeking mental health providers in order to get help.
And we are dealing with so much. It's like all the factors that you just mentioned. It's hard to know where to even start to unpack all of this. But one thing I know for sure is that some of that trauma comes from our own communities. Some of that trauma is culturally based. And I know me personally, there are some things I experienced within my family, within my childhood, that I would rather have skipped. So can any of you ladies speak to that? Mildred, you wrote a whole book about it. Tell me.
Yeah, my book, The Gladioli Are Invisible, it deals with, it talks about what I saw growing up in the Haitian community. It talks about the Haitian immigrants that I grew up around and the hardship that I witnessed, and also some of the things that I experienced myself. In one particular chapter, I talk about Peter, who was a lawyer in Haiti, and this was during the Francois Duvalier regime. And because a lot of his friends, a lot of his family members were being murdered, they were being disappeared, they went missing because they said something against the government. And he realized that he couldn't stay there anymore. And so he packs up and he moves his family to the United States. They moved to Brooklyn, in the community where I grew up in. And of course, what do we know about when you're a lawyer? If you have your license in another state, even if it's in the United States, you can't pass the bar in New Jersey and go and practice in New York. Well, the same is true if you're going from a foreign country to a new country. And so here he is. He loses his stature. He loses his respect. People see him as an exotic, strange-looking Black man who speaks with a weird accent, right? And he had his practice in Haiti, and he comes to the United States, and he couldn't practice. And so what does he do? He applies for a job as a mailman in a corporate building. And so because of that, depression set in and he started to drink. And it wreaked havoc on his family life and on his career, on his personal life, and he ended up dying from cirrhosis of the liver. So that's just a very brief Reader's Digest version of some of the things that I write about. But these were all stories that experience that I saw around me from the Haitian people who immigrated here, and they were trying to live their best life, right? Trying to leave the Francois Duvalier regime, because most of the stories are from that time period. But once they came here to the United States, it was a whole new set of problems that they had to deal with. But yet, I think the other thing too about the problems with these immigrants is they may have gone into depression. Maybe they started to drink to kind of forget their problems. But for the most part, they didn't realize that they were depressed. They didn't realize that they were suffering from generational trauma. They didn't realize that these were emotional problems that should have been addressed. They were focusing on paying their bills and, keeping a roof over their heads. And so these are some of the stories that I write about. Yeah.
Right. And so often survival is what takes precedence, and mental health takes a backseat. And I know that some of the trauma that I personally experienced in my background came at the hands of my parents, because corporal punishment was a thing in my house. And that has some very real impacts, I think, going into your adulthood. Now, Dr. Eve or Charlene, is this something that you can relate to? And have you seen the effects in your adult life?
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for having this panel. I think this is a critically important conversation. And for me, I would say there's not only corporal punishment, but the messages that we receive as Haitian children, as youth, and the way that your parents, even though they want the best for you, the way that they manifest their care for you is not always in a way that is loving. So we don't tell our children that we love them. We don't tell them that we care for them. We tell them rather that you will amount to nothing, that you are nothing, that you don't work hard enough, and A is not good enough. You need to get an A plus. We really beat them down. And when you are an immigrant, when you are a youth, you're already living in a space where you are treated as other. And for me, I also came here in the US during in the early 90s when Haitians were taught to have brought AIDS to America. So you have all of these stigmas, you have all of these difficulties culturally, linguistically, that you are struggling with, wanting to assimilate into the new culture, even though we know assimilation is not ideal, but you want to fit in as a youth, and you get these messages that really kill your self-esteem. And so you grow up to become a professional who is beaten down in the places where you should have found love. And it really doesn't help your confidence. And then you go into professional life, and we know all of the microaggressions and all the issues that Black women face. It just exacerbates years of difficulties that we've encountered, and then trying to figure out, how do I navigate these professional spaces as someone who has very little social capital, someone whose confidence was beaten out of them as a youth, and someone who may not have the network to know how to move up the career ladder, or how to deal with conflict in the workplace, or how to build one's tool bag as we confront different situations. So as a mom, I have made it a point to tell my children every day that I love them, and what matters is that they do their best. And my daughter has asked me, what if my best is I bring an F back? And I said, that's okay, as long as you give it your best. And so I think it's important for us to tell our children that it doesn't matter what they bring home. A report card does not define you. Your very essence, your being, the breath that you take is enough for me to love you, and I love you unconditionally. So I think it behooves us to reinforce these messages, not just with our own children, but with other Haitian and Caribbean youth and young people for whom we know those simple words, I love you, I'm proud of you, I care for you, will make a meaningful and lasting difference.
Absolutely. Wonderfully said. I know as a Haitian child or a Haitian American child, we learn trauma before we learn communication, before we learn identity, before we learn who we are. A lot of the times, Haitian parents, I know that they have done their best, but they don't see their children as people, but rather an extension of themselves. And so that comes with putting their own trauma on their children. And as a child, you don't really have an identity. You do what you're told, and we were also taught, no eye contact, look down, don't talk back, and when we're hit, we don't get an explanation. And I know, that form of discipline hitting your child really stems from slavery, where slave masters would hit slaves. And I know in the Haitian community, respect equates to authority. Just do what you're told. And that also stems from slavery, where respect is just doing what I tell you and not asking any questions. And so it's difficult. And we don't get to have these conversations. We don't often have safe spaces. And when we try to have them with former generations, with family, just within the culture, there's a lot of pushback because it's really hard to have someone hold a mirror up to you. And we're also met with a lot of defensiveness, like I did the best that I could. And I understand that, meaning how can someone know any better when they weren't taught any better? But it can also be an excuse, as we're living in a new time, a new world where these conversations can be had. Though difficult, they're necessary.
I think, but to your point, Charlene, excellent point. I experienced very similar things to what you said and also what you said, Marley. But I think as an adult right now and looking back on it and trying to figure out what the hell happened, right? I asked myself, what's going on? What happened to these people? And what I think it is generational trauma. I really do. And I think it's generational trauma going way back. And I'm talking way back to the time when Columbus brought the first group of enslaved Africans to Haiti in 1517. The horrors of slavery that these people experience, getting their feet cut off if they tried to run, being humiliated, getting raped, and all the rest of it. These are horrors that our ancestors suffered. And, because they were slaves, because they weren't seen as human, they didn't have the, not just the wherewithal, but basically the luxury, I would say, right? The luxury to look at themselves, to see themselves as a full human being and to try to figure out what went wrong in their lives. And so because that never happened, it went from generation to generation. Now, here we are in present day in Haiti, right? And you have a country that has a decaying infrastructure. You have a country where the electricity, you'll be lucky if there's electricity, at least 3 or 4 times a week when you go down there, right? The healthcare infrastructure is crumbling. And so because of that, because of the basics are not met, people are still trying to figure out where are they going to live, where are they going to, how are they going to put food on the table, how are they going to get resources to take care of their family. There is no time to take care of mental health because the basic necessities are not addressed first. And I think that's the biggest problem that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And before we go on, I want to encourage everyone who is watching to comment, ask questions. If there is a question that you have or an issue that you are going through that you'd like us to weigh in on, or you'd like Dr. Vanessa to address and perhaps share a few words on, please reach out in the comments, ask us. We want to let you know that this is a safe, kind, nurturing space. All are welcome. And we would love to address any issues that you may have. And Dr. Vanessa, earlier you mentioned the concept of potomitan, which literally translated means central pole. Like it's the pillar that is holding the whole house up. Can you give us, from a clinical perspective, what someone who holds that role might experience and what we may go through and how we can just feel better and shed these boxes that we're in?
Yes, absolutely. One thing that I wanted to add to what was just said before in terms of intergenerational trauma, like going back to slavery, I think it's also kind of like thinking about how, as a Haitian community or even as Black people, oftentimes we are not, or, from the slavery, you didn't have the luxury to be able to cry, to be able to express your emotion, right? You had to keep a certain face or otherwise you would get beaten, right? And so that has been transmitted from generation to generation, where it's just like this cultural thing of just like tough, like you got to suck it up, you just got to keep going. You know, if I'm thinking even the terms in Haitian Creole, it's like not can be nous la n'après du. It's just like not like we just got to keep going and going and going. And again, just like I had said before, just like, you know, repressing all those emotions and like controlling all this stress and not having an outlet, that will definitely do a lot of damage emotionally. Now, to answer your question in terms of like, what are some signs and symptoms to kind of look out for that would indicate that we may be vulnerable to depression or to an anxiety disorder or even to PTSD, is usually it's just like looking at it in terms of like, okay, in terms like, am I able to, oftentimes Haitian people, because they're so resilient and they've internalized that message of we have to keep going and going and going. Usually, you know, in North America, they would say in terms of diagnosing somebody, it's like, well, if they're not functioning at all, if they're unable to work, if they're unable to do certain things, then that's when we diagnose them. Except in the Haitian community, you can still have a depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder, and still go to work because that's part of our culture to keep going. But it doesn't mean that we're not suffering. So again, with that intergenerational trauma from the slavery, it's just like, I just have to keep going in order to survive, right? And so things that people can see is, for example, if you're unable, like if every day seems like it takes an immense amount of effort to just get through your day, that's a sign right there. Like if the smallest thing, like getting out of bed, brushing your teeth every day is really requires a lot of effort, that's a red flag right there. If it's difficult for you that even though, let's say you're a mom and you're taking care of everything, you're doing everything well, but you're unable to find joy every day in your life and you're feeling down, that's another red flag. If it's difficult that even though you can do your work, but it might be difficult to focus. Maybe it takes you twice the time to do something that you used to do in half the time. That's another red flag. If you have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep, insomnia, or if you're sleeping more than usual, if you're lacking motivation in general, if you tend to isolate yourself, like social withdrawal is a big one. In the Haitian community, depression research has shown that depression is often manifested in terms of what we call somatic complaints, which is physical complaints, like headaches, stomach aches, all kinds of physical aches for which there's no real biological underpinning. Like let's say you go to your PCP, they do different tests and they don't notice anything, but you have those frequent aches. What happens is because culturally as well, we're not, we have not internalized that it is okay to talk about our feelings. So when we don't talk about it, it gets translated into those physical symptoms. So that's another red flag. Other things is just like being chronically hypervigilant when we're talking about trauma. I know what was discussed earlier in the panel is just like, the microaggression and the racial trauma and, just the stressors, different stressors in life, family stressors, being an immigrant in this country, navigating like the social cultural differences between Haiti and here, the language, like there's so much that amounts, right? And that can lead somebody to really if you cannot process all of this, then you can lash out at people, be more irritable. That's another red flag. But you can also be hypervigilant, which is one of the major pillars of PTSD, is just like not trusting the system. If the system has constantly failed you in different ways, then you're always going to be on the lookout. You are always going to be on high alert. And also another thing is like as parents, if you have a family, if you feel like, okay, yes, I can take care of my kids, I'm doing my job, but I'm not emotionally present for my family members, that's another red flag. In terms of what can be done, I mean, there's in terms of like, how can you better take care of yourself? I think it's first and foremost, I would say, is to find your village. And what I mean by that, your social support network. Do you have a group of people? It could be friends, trusted family members, but you have to choose them carefully in terms of like people that you feel understand you, can validate you, can understand your experiences, can provide you with a lot of like validation and understanding and support. Like it's really important to have that village or to try to construct it, to develop it, I should say. Because there's nothing better than like, let's say you're with your group of like fellow girlfriends, and then they understand the, you know, the microaggressions you go through every day at work. They understand being Haitian. You're just like a network of people with whom you can acknowledge your feelings. You can, you know, explore your feelings, but also you can get some advice. Um, I would say also it's to make time for self-care. And I know that's not something like, especially if I'm thinking about my parents' generation, like, what do you mean? Kibaisa, self-care? Like, you know, just like, because again, we've been in, you know, so kind of conditioned as women to be potomitan. You just gotta, you don't like, again, you don't have the luxury or the space to be able to even acknowledge, like, I'm tired. Like, I think the concept of potomitan also implies that as women, as Haitian women, we don't need to be nurtured. We don't need to be supported, right? So it's to kind of like, also part of it is to deconstruct all these things that we have internalized that are not necessarily true, especially if they're stemming from intergenerational trauma. And so the self-care aspect is just like, I say the first thing is just like, do one thing at least every day that brings you joy. And that one thing looks different. It could be as trivial of like, oh, every day I'm going to go to my favorite coffee shop and stay there for an hour and do whatever. It's like whatever brings you joy. But there's also different types of self-care that one can engage in, but it has to be a self-care activity that brings you joy and that brings you happiness. So there's different dimensions of self-care. There's what we call emotional self-care, which can be like writing my thoughts and my emotions and letting them out in a journal, or letting them out through art, or through meditation. You know, there is physical self-care. It's just like, okay, exercise releases endorphins, which are hormones that bring about happiness, but also it's a great way to release stress. Or it could be dance. You know, then you have like spiritual self-care. Let's look at the Haitian community is very spiritual and religious. It's absolutely okay to rely on your faith and your spiritual beliefs in order to bring you that, you know, that support that you need in moments of stress. You know, you have social self-care, which I talked about before, having your village that supports you. You can have also sensory self-care. So like, you know, burning scented oils, candles, like whatever, again, can soothe you. But I always advise people to like engage in self-care on a daily basis. Now, what I get as an answer is, oh, baguette, I don't have time. But it's like, even if it's 20 minutes, it's so important, like, to ground yourself. And if you don't have time every day, but at least during the weekend, like carving out some time, because it's like, you know, as they say, you can't pour from an empty cup. So it's also like to be the best mother, the best sister, the best wife, or the best daughter that you can be. You also need to, you know, have that energy, but also be happy and feel well.
But I also think one way to implement self-care is to just say no. And I think boundaries are so important, especially if you are that person in your family who is the potomita, where everyone lays all the burden at your feet. Everyone expects you to handle everything. Everyone looks to you to fix it. I know, Dr. Eve, you can relate to that. Speak on it, please.
Absolutely. And I think that's the burden that we bear. And for me, being the oldest and also being the one who was the first to achieve, that people look at you and say, oh, you've got it all. You know everything. I can send my friend to you. And, you know, I have 7 godchildren, right? M'gon bonne fille. And everyone's like, yeah, take care of this person, take care. And then you got ma tante ici, mon oncle ici, people in Haiti, people in the US, people in the Dominican Republic, people in France, thinking that I can resolve all of the problems. And I think, you know, I share my experience, but I know that I am not unique in that regard. And about 7 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, I realized that I needed help for myself. And I also wanted to be a different parent than the parent I had been before. And I was afraid to spend time with my own children because I thought that I would become my own mother with my children. I was so afraid. I didn't want to screw them up. And so I thought I will just stay away. And in talking to my therapist, so I was very lucky. I spent hours and hours, and I found this Black Haitian woman therapist who's a Gen Xer and an older Gen Xer. And I was like, Merci bon Dieu, hallelujah. I have just arrived. Samdap cherchant à terre, samdap cherchant lem joigni à terre. I was so happy, and my therapist has been someone who has been with me, alongside me through my professional journey, through my personal journey, and through my journey with motherhood. And I credit her with for me having the relationship that I have with my children, because she was the one who said you're very conscious of breaking that cycle, right? You want to do better by and with and for your children, and you want to have a relationship with them. You should invest in that, as opposed to withdrawing and just seeing yourself as the breadwinner. So I was able to have someone with whom I could navigate motherhood, and someone to whom I could bring my professional challenges, my personal challenges, and someone who held me accountable for choosing differently and for also putting myself first. And she's seen me through many different challenges. She's seen me struggle with, suicidal thoughts. She's seen me struggle with low self confidence. She's seen me struggle with imposter syndrome. And right now, she's seeing me choosing to live my life and to allow joy in my life. And for me, it's a very different space. And at times I've thought, okay, this is the time that I stop. I don't need to see a therapist anymore. I'm good now. But I realize I need that self accountability. I need to have a partner. I need someone who can help me with maintaining social connection, because I have learned through her that social isolation is terrible for me. And that leads me to a completely different arena. And she's also the one who's helped me to realize that perhaps having a job that consumes me 24/7 is not the lifestyle that I should lead. And if I have an opportunity to choose differently, I should really consider that opportunity. So she's helped me make those very difficult decisions. And what I want to share with folks who may be listening to this themselves, and folks who may want to share with their loved ones the insights from this panel, what I want to share is that there should be no stigma in seeing a therapist, no stigma in prioritizing yourself, no stigma in saying, I'm going to take care of myself so that I can be better for myself and better for others and live the life that I want, and not the life that I am told I should live, not pursue a degree in nursing, even though I have no interest in nursing. So all of those things to make your own path and pursue your own journey.
Yes, and therapy is self-care. Make no mistake about that. But we have a question from Luigi, who is watching on Facebook. He asks, what have been one of the best coping strategies you women have found yourself implementing over the years, and what caused the need for it? So Shirley, and since you are the queen of self-care, I will let you share what you do.
Oh, sure. I can take this one. I would say journaling has been just one of the most important things. Writing is really talking to yourself, I say, without being interrupted. You know, a lot of the times, our mothers, fathers, or family, they have so much in their plate and they can't take the emotional spillage. So I would say journal, write about everything, write about nothing. And I would also, to echo Dr. Eve's point, it's okay to have a therapist. And I know a lot of people, cannot afford it, but there are affordable options out there. If you do some research, I would say a therapist is definitely, the way to go. And I would say too, just little things like taking a shower with some nice body wash, just getting some body butter, affirmations in the mirror saying, I can do this, I am valid, I am important, I am beautiful, I have wings and I will use them. And also just learning these days to put yourself before others. And I know for so long we never agreed with that because we thought it was selfish, but it's selfish to your own self to put others before you. And we carry so much all the time, and it's really okay to say no, to not answer that phone call, to not reply to that email the same second you saw it, and just reinforcing boundaries. In our Haitian culture, we don't know what boundaries are. It's like Do this right now. Call me back right now. And it's okay to say, not yet, not now. I cannot do this. No, I cannot let you borrow that 500. so those are the things that I practice myself. I'd love to hear from you ladies too.
Yes, Mildred, tell us, what do you do?
Well, I started on this self-care journey, and I do call it a journey because I feel like I've graduated as the years have progressed. But since my divorce, I would honestly say it was my divorce that started this whole thing for me. And it was my divorce that made me become an adult, if that makes any sense, right? I started learning how to journal. I started doing that, as Charlene does. I am I'm a lover of outdoors, so I usually like to go out and take a nice walk in the park among the trees, hearing the squirrels, the birds chirp and looking at the squirrels. That makes me happy. That brings me joy, breathing in the fresh air, communing with nature. For me, nature is a representative of God. And so that helps me. Going by the water and just being close to those negative ions. I wrote a portion of my book, as a matter of fact, by the water. So sitting by the Hudson River, I live up here in the Northeast. That helps me. That brings me joy. Going to Sephora and finding out which shade of red lipstick. I mean, I have like 5 shades of red lipstick in my medicine cabinet, but getting another one, a sixth one, that brings me joy. I mean, honestly,
Yeah.
New hair. That
right. And of course, going to the gym, and the funny thing is, I was telling a student of mine the other day, I always drag my feet going into the gym, but when I come out of the gym, I always, I'm happy, but not because I'm leaving, but because as the doctor just said, the endorphins, the serotonin that builds up as you exercise, it makes me feel good. And I know that I'm doing something for myself. A lot of affirmations. I do affirmations daily. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I started doing is Louise Hay. She was a metaphysicist, I mean, for lack of a better term. She was a spiritualist, and she has some cards where each card is a different affirmation. So I have them in all areas of the house. I also have them in my car. I also do aromatherapy. I think it's germain oil. I think I'm butchering the name, but anyway, I have it in my car. And I kind of waft it under my nose every time I get stuck in a traffic jam. It's a way to just kind of, bring back and just kind of center myself. So to answer your question, there's not one thing that I do, but it's several things. Yeah.
I would say for me, I go dancing, and like Marley, I need sun and the Caribbean warm water.
Yes.
I need to get out of the country, and at least once a year, and or go to Florida, whatever it may be, and I need to dance and be with my girlfriends.
Yes, amen to that. I mean, a good beach day will cure almost anything for me. And also, I think one thing that we don't talk about a lot is just plain old exercise. Now, I know if you're in sort of a mind frame where you're down, it's hard to like make that leap to get up and go, but it really is the quickest way to a better mood. Once you crank out like a half hour doing anything, it could be hula hooping, dancing, jumping up and down, whatever it is you want to do, that movement in your body is literally life changing. So if I could add anything, it would be that.
No, absolutely. And I would echo what everybody has said so far. But what I'm hearing too underneath all of that is doing things that bring you joy. That is so important to even think about, because sometimes because people are always on the go, go, go. And I've asked this of friends or even patients, like, what makes you happy? And they're like, wait a minute, I have to think about it. Right. And I said, it doesn't have to be grandiose. It could be as much like, talking to a good girlfriend who makes me laugh. For me, for example, it's just like getting my manicure and pedicure just brings me so much joy. And I try to do it like at least twice a month. Just these little things. I think sometimes people think that it has to be a big thing. Yes. And I would emphasize, yes, definitely exercise, like even taking like 10-15-minute walk. We start with that and longer walks. And that, allows you to kind of think things through, but also it's good. And again, it's releasing endorphins, which is like really like a stress buster, which is what we need. And I think for me recently, I've like picking up swimming. I feel like swimming, the water, it's so therapeutic, but also it helps with like the deep breathing. It's like really, again, self-care. It's important to take care of yourself in order to be there for you, so then you can be more available to others.
And I would also add, just a little addition, music. Music
Mm,
is fantastic. It is a great way. It is one of the things that I use to raise my vibration. If I'm having a bad day at work, if I'm just having a bad day overall, I just put on I mean, I love music, any genre, and I just put it on. And I'm known for singing in the shower, but also singing while I'm driving down the road at the top of my
mhm,
lungs.
mhm.
I mean, it makes me happy. And it's amazing how you can just go from 0 to 60 in a nanosecond when your favorite song comes on. So
That's
that's
true.
the other thing too, I would like to add.
Mhm.
And Sunny, who is watching on Facebook, says, Amen. We carry such heavy loads all the time. So self care is so important. And we all
Mhm.
agree with that. But one thing I would be remiss without mentioning is that our plight as Black women in America, as Haitian women in America, is very different than women who are in Haiti, where that glass ceiling is very much in place, where the place of a woman is much more defined, let's say, and it's harder to break out of those constructs. I know, Mildred, you're very connected to what's happening in Haiti. Can you tell us a little bit about the plight of Haitian women when it comes to mental health in Haiti?
Well, in Haiti, well, we call women the potomita all the time, right? And they're the central figure. I mean, actually, the potomita is actually a central pillar in a voodoo ceremony. So when we're talking about women, that's really a metaphor that we're using for them. But it's a very loose metaphor because when you think about what Haitian women are suffering, um, the misogyny that exists in Haiti, the patriarchy that exists in
Mhm.
Haiti, um, it makes it very, very challenging, very, very difficult for women to loosen themselves from those very strict roles. The roles that are created are basically created by men. I mean, just let's be
Mhm.
honest. That's really what it is. And these roles are so that women can take care of everybody else, take care of the men, take care of the children, and in that sense, hence the name potomitan, but not take care of themselves, right? And and we're not just talking about the physical aspect. I'm also talking about education. For the most part, there are many women, too many women in Haiti who don't have fair access to education, who are in relationships, in marriages, or in partnerships where they are being abused every day, physically abused, financially abused, sexually abused. The thing is that when they are abused, they're not allowed to talk about it. And if they do talk about it, they're the ones who are blamed. And I'm not talking about just the middle-aged woman, a woman in her 20s or 30s. I'm talking about even from a child who's 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, a young girl who's raped. She's the one who's blamed. There's practically no responsibility that's placed on the men. And the
Mhm.
men have created this umbrella, so to speak, so that they feel a sense of privilege. But I think what they're missing is, although they may get off easily, right? They're also suffering as well. Why? Because they're putting their heels on the necks of women, and women make up 50% of the population. A country is not allowed, it cannot progress if 50% of the population is under somebody else's foot. I mean, it's just not going to work. And so I think that's another big issue that we're facing in the Haitian motherland.
And Dr. Vanessa, what are some of the concerns that a woman who lives in a more patriarchal society faces in terms of trying to be healthy and self care and instituting boundaries? I mean, is there any hope in that situation?
I, you know, the way that I look at it is just like, I think in a patriarchal society, which is not only in Haiti, also here in the United States, within our own community, it makes it more difficult in terms of, there's this fear, but it's also kind of like, because of patriarchy, as women, we're made to feel like, as you guys were expressing before, like it's our fault, right? We're feeling guilty for even feeling sad or depressed. The pressures that are put on us, we're feeling a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment. And again, all of these emotions makes us more vulnerable to mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety. So I would say the challenge in that, in terms of living of it in a patriarchal society, is making women, and that's why like that's part of the reason why the rates of depression are double in women versus men. I think that's the aspect too. How we're socialized as women, we're more vulnerable to sexual violence. We're more vulnerable to sexual violence and body image issues. Like all of that encompasses, is within patriarchy. The messages that we're internalizing, we're supposed to look a certain way. We're supposed to be not only look sexy, look a certain way. We have to be the best wives that we can be. We have to be, but also there's a lot of what? Body shaming, mom shaming, all of that, right? That makes us even more vulnerable to mental health disorders in comparison to men. Not that men are not vulnerable to mental health disorders, but that makes us more vulnerable to that. So I would say that is the challenge, where we feel as women then that it's then more difficult to deconstruct those patriarchal messages that we have internalized and the way that we are socialized, right? And so sometimes it's really important then to get the help of a therapist to help us unpack all of that and feel that no longer seeing ourselves as like we are part of the problem. But I think also in the American society, well, the same thing in Haiti, you tend to just blame the person instead of blaming the context. Because sometimes that it's most of the times the context plays a huge role in what is happening to a person, and therapy can help a lot of with that. And going back to what I had said earlier, like the other thing in terms of like, if we're thinking about the Haitian community, not only is there the mental health stigma, but also there's a stigma about what is therapy, right? And I think there's a lot of misinformation about what happens in therapy. And so there's a lot of education that we have to do within the communities to educate them about like, oh, what is exactly therapy? How does it work? What is its purpose? And I also think like there's this huge misrepresentation of therapy as like, oh, it's only moon fu, people who are crazy who needs therapy. It's about therapy is not only about people with severe mental illnesses. It's a safe place to not only for personal growth, but also to get validation, to get support, to further understand yourself, to unpack trauma, to unpack very toxic messages that you have internalized, to achieve wellness, to achieve inner peace. You can go to therapy for any given stressors that you are experiencing. And it's actually a good and healthy coping mechanism. So there needs to be a lot of work that needs to be done to really raise awareness about what is mental health and what is therapy, to unpack or try to undo like the negative messages that have been perpetuated for years and years about mental health.
I would also say that there is fear of therapy, right? You go see therapy, you're about to get DSS, they're gonna call DSS,
Yes.
DTF on you, so there is all of that that is going on. And I think there is also the fact that we don't talk about things, right?
Right.
We sweep things
Mhm.
under the rug. And I know, Mildred, in your book, you talk about that too. Certain things, certain topics you just never talk about. So
Mhm.
we don't allow a space even for discussion for people, for youth, for even adults to surface that there is a conflict, that a trauma took place. What are we going to do about it? And then on the flip side, it's also being very concerned and explicit about the kinds of behaviors that we want to see from the males, from the young child. What kinds of messages are we giving? Are we delivering? What kinds of behaviors, what kinds of expectations are we setting for young men, for youth? In my household growing up, I had to be home after school every day to cook for everybody, to pick up my little sister from daycare. But my brothers, they went on, they played
Mm.
instruments, they participated in athletics, they went on trips. I never did any of that. The expectation was that I would be home taking care of everyone as the oldest of
Mhm.
six and then eventually the oldest of seven. And the boys had no expectations of their time. So even if you never talk about, even if you never say to your son, you are king of the household, the way that you behave,
Mhm.
the sort of choices that you give them and the ones that you deny the girls also very implicitly and very explicitly too communicate who has power, who doesn't have power, who gets to have opportunities, and who doesn't. So I think as aunts, as friends, as parents, when we see these kinds of behaviors, it's important to call them out. And sometimes it's implicit because we grew up with these kinds of behaviors. It's unconscious, and they feel normal. We've normalized them.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it's important, so that if we want that cycle to break, we have to be willing to have those conversations, those expectations, and to also disrupt the behaviors that are then continued for generations and perpetuated over time.
And to your point, Eve, I think, I mean, what you said about how the men are not, they're not held to any kind of responsibility whatsoever. Another thing that I've noticed as an example of all of this is if a woman is assaulted, if she's sexually assaulted, physically assaulted, if she's attacked, and it doesn't matter how old she is, and she goes to complain about it, and she goes to talk to another female in her community, in the Haitian community, for the most part, not all, but too many times this happens. For the most part, the women they will side with the aggressor. You know, it's almost like Stockholm syndrome. Maybe Dr. Prosper, maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that. But I think it's siding with the aggressor. It's Stockholm syndrome, where the women they basically put the blame on the victim. You know, and the man who actually who started the attack, he's not blamed at all. There's no responsibility that he has to carry. So I'm curious about that.
I
And I've
wanted
seen
to
it
add
many
So
times.
go ahead, Shirley.
Oh, to your point, Mildred, wonderful points on just on patriarchy. It's sounding like internalized patriarchy, just like
Yeah.
internalized anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the times women will internalize patriarchy as a coping and survival mechanism. And they will just reinforce gender roles. And they don't understand how just awful that is, and it just keeps the cycle of violence going. And to Dr. Prosper's point, there's a lot of unlearning that we have to do, and it's ongoing, and it will be a lifetime.
But I'm just wondering what kind of, and I understand that completely because I've experienced it and I've seen it too many times. But my issue is this: what kind of damage and what kind of message does this send to the victim? Right? I mean, I've had that happen to me. And it took me years and years and years through therapy and talking to people that I trust to kind of shake that off. But what kind of message are we sending to the victims? You know, I think that's
Absolutely.
re-victimizing them.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, I remember my first husband who was physically abusive. When I left him, my mom would say, "Oh, he called Lishagre. He misses you. What are you going to do?" It's like, did you not see what this man did to me over and over again? And now, because he's sad, he's missing me, rather than taking my side as my mother, as my father, as telling this person, you are not welcomed in our home. You have mistreated our daughter. You've mistreated our child. Instead, you're telling me, run back to him. It's like, how many times did this person come close to killing me? And how many times were you witness to that? And still, you feel sad and sympathy and empathy for him, and you want me to go back. So, there's so many things in our psychology, in terms of the lack of boundaries, to your point, Charlene, that we are not just willing to accept, but we are comfortable with, and we have normalized.
Right.
Exactly to your point, Dr. Eve. I mean, self-care is one thing, and we can always do better moving forward, but there's a whole infrastructure that we came from that is firmly in place. And Dr. Eve, you mentioned calling it out, and that can be an extremely difficult thing to do. It requires a lot of courage. And I remember before my mom passed, God rest her soul, I tried to address some of the issues of my childhood with her, and she was having none of it. She wasn't angry. She said, "Look how good you turned out. You're so ungrateful."
Wow.
So it's like, how do we call it out, Dr. Vanessa? I mean, is this something that we can do? I mean, please tell us, because like I said, we can fix it going forward because that part is within our control. But what about the construct we came from?
I think there's two things. First thing is just like definitely
it's communication. I mean, I'm thinking kind of like having some of those conversations with my parents. I think, for example, my dad came to realize, but way after the fact, how wrong it was to use corporal punishment and making the connection with like slavery. It's like I was doing the same thing and I apologize. And it depending, I mean, everybody knows their parents really well, right? Some parents like these, the way they've been socialized, the cultural aspect, it's so deeply ingrained that you may not change their mind. But I still think that it's to go about it in a way of like educating them, making them aware. Like I always say, like when you provide feedback, you start with the positives, like, you know, I love you, mom, you've been a great mom. But and then the sandwich aspect of it, then okay, here are things that you may have not realized was abusive, even though you did, like, you know, there's intention and there's impact, right? Even though you didn't intend to do this, this is how it was received. This is how it can be harmful. I understand that that's the way you've been raised, or that's, you know, that's what you know, but just like kind of like taking it from an educational standpoint. And sometimes it could make a difference, but also I think it's like managing our expectation, because sometimes those things also are so deeply ingrained. And in those instances where a parent, let's say, would minimize what you're telling them, or they don't want to accept you know, your point of view or validate your point of view, then it's really then learning like, how do I navigate a relationship with someone, or and while protecting myself and my boundaries, how do I navigate a relationship with someone who is unable to change, right? And that you can get support from, you know, like I said, your village, or you can get support from a therapist to help you with that. You know, how do I accept my mom as she is, while also protecting my space, protecting my feelings, and making her respect my boundaries, right? Especially if she's not open to hear or to understand my perspective in terms of how she could have been harmful to me, or she could have been verbally or emotionally abusive. Because, you know, there's a lot of thing about disciplining children in the Haitian culture that is very verbally abusive. You know, just talking down to kids, right? That our parents don't realize. It's like, no, it's tough love. Because if I don't do this, you know, you wouldn't be who you are today if I didn't do that.
If I didn't break you down. And by the way, I don't know how to say I love you, and I don't know how to say I'm sorry.
Exactly.
It's almost as if softness is not something that exists for us. It's as if softness is only an idea that exists for white people. We're not able to be soft. We're not allowed to just be leisurely, have fun, have communication, say I love you. And it's almost as if too, so many people in our families are undiagnosed. You know, oh, tonton est tel parle en pile, tonton est tel, that's how he is. People are going undiagnosed. They can't name it to tame it. They don't know what it is that's going on with them. And when they see that you're able to do it, there's this anger there. They couldn't get healing, and they couldn't name their trauma. And there's this anger there that you're doing it. And so they just don't want to talk about it because it hurts even more.
Yeah.
To your point, Charlene, excellent point. There's also, I think, a jealousy that comes from relationships between immigrant Haitian parents, and first generation, especially if you are ambitious and you're going for your college education, you're going for your master's or your PhD. And I've heard this in my family. I've heard it with other first generation people. The parents would say, well, you think you're smarter than me now that you have a college education? I've heard that over and over and over again. And I think that comes from the generational trauma. That's what
they will acknowledge, you know, hey, when are you getting married? When are you having children? Right. But if you get a master's or a PhD, no one talks about it. Right. Because culturally, they don't care about you being an overachiever, which is rooted in trauma. Exactly. You know, but they will talk about, you know, where is your husband? When are you having kids? So, yeah.
So true. So sad.
So Sony, who is watching on Facebook, she says, she asks, how do we start setting healthy examples for our children, especially our girls and young women, around mental health? That seems like a perfect question for you, Dr. Vanessa.
Yes, that's a great question. I would say, like, what I tell when I work with parents, you know, your kids are watching you all the time. They're absorbing what you're doing. So you need to model how to take care of yourself. You need to model. That's how they're going to learn in terms of what's healthy for them, what mentally healthy is. So the first place to start to set good examples is to take care of yourself. And if need be, to go to therapy, unpack what I like to say, unpack what's in your baggage of issues, deconstruct things so that you can show your kids like, okay, it's okay to go to therapy, to work through your issues, to grow, right? And also in terms of coping skills, setting the example like, hey, mom is taking time or dad is taking time to take care of themselves, right? So that they can be more emotionally present for you. I also say that kind of like teaching kids like about emotions, right? It seems simple, but yet not really. Because like if you ask kids sometimes like, hey, how do you feel? It's not something like, or teenagers, oh, I'm feeling okay, I'm feeling fine. But really building that emotions vocabulary. What I always suggest to parents is like, spend quality time with your children. I understand life is busy, but if you can create kind of this schedule where once a week you do a fun activity with each of your child, if you have more than one child, but like pick a time. It could be 30 minutes each week. It's like you and I time. And let's say your kid loves to play soccer or go for a walk. You go for a walk. You talk. You ask about their day. You ask about, because the thing is, it builds trust, but also you get to know them and you get to guide whatever they are sharing with you, rather than them getting all this information from friends, a lot of misinformation or, not the best, advice. But also showing them, sharing with them. I know I've learned from my parents in terms of like how to stand up for yourself, how to, how to manage stress. My father always, for example, was a model of self-care. Even though he worked a lot, his self-care was playing music, like playing piano. He plays to this day piano every day. And I know that that's his place to release stress, right? So to me, it's just like, oh, he works hard, but he also self-cares hard, if there's such a term. So I think sometimes parents are like, it's not that you're educating through modeling, right? But also through spending time. When I would say in terms of building their emotions vocabulary, like how do you feel? But also you talking about your own feelings. Like you can be frustrated. I think the Haitian way sometimes is just like, go to your room, or just like yelling and putting your child down. But instead of being like, right now, the fact that you have not cleaned your room is really stressing me out. It's really making me feel angry. And I know a lot of Haitian parents, my generation, be like laughing at what I'm saying right now, but not like this is true. You're modeling like feelings, right? This is why I'm frustrated with you. Or did you even think about the consequences of not cleaning your room? And explaining as well. There was something that was just so frustrating to me that my parents would say, well, because I said so. It's just like, no, if you can explain it to me, then maybe it might help me better abide by your rule, or better understand that there's a logic to this, right? So it's really kind of fostering communication. That's why I'm saying, like, really spending time once a week, connecting with your child to an activity that they love, or an activity that you both enjoy.
Well, Venice, who is watching on Facebook, is this your mom, Dr. Vanessa?
No.
She's my mother. That's my mother.
I love it. I love it. You know what? You do look alike. Look at the picture.
Very good point, daughter.
That's my twin.
Well, this Haitian mom is being very nurturing and supportive,
Yes.
and I'm here for that.
Yes.
I love it. I love it.
Awesome. Well, as we begin to wrap this up, I want to go around to each one of you ladies, and we'll get back around to you, Dr. Vanessa, to give me your final thoughts. And before we begin that process, I would like anyone who is watching to take this time. If you've been a little shy, you've been hesitant to chime in and ask your questions, because I know it's personal, the time is now, because we are getting ready to wrap this up. So please chime in with your questions and your comments, and we would love to address them. But let's just go around the screen. I'll start with you, Shirley, since you're right next to me that way.
Sure.
Yeah, tell me your final thoughts, and what do you want to say in terms of Black women and mental health in the Haitian community?
I love my Haitian sisters. And what I want to say to my Haitian community is, l'Église, l'huile masqueti and thé gingembre cannot fix everything. We have to communicate. We have to talk about how we're feeling. We have to love on each other. And we have to learn how to validate ourselves. We will not always get the apology from the parent or the friend or the family member. And we won't always get the applause or the support. And so it really is an inside job that will just permeate on the outside. So just learning to love ourselves first and then supporting each other a little more.
Well, Charlene, your mom loves us all, she says. Love you, ladies. I'm here with you. We appreciate you, Venice. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So, Mildred, it's your screen. Take it away.
Well, a few things. I think the most important lesson I would say is self-love. I think that's one of the things I had to learn from myself within the last several years. So that's number one. And number two, because I am an educator, I would say education is another thing. What's nice in this year of 2022 is that the world has gotten smaller. Why? Because of the internet. We can be in different parts of the world, but yet it seems smaller because we can come together and, and talk to each other like we're doing right now, right? So because of that, I think the internet is going to be one of the things that might be the catalyst that helps turn this whole thing around, especially with our female sisters in Haiti. Mostly everybody has a cell phone. They may not have a place to live, but they have a cell phone, right? And on that cell phone, most Haitians have WhatsApp. So that portal of the internet, I think, is showing them how other women in other parts of the world live. And I think just by seeing those pictures, by seeing those visuals, I think that's sparking something to show them that, look, I don't have to live this way because there's this woman who lives in the United States. There's this woman who lives in Portugal. She's a middle-aged woman like me, and she has it going on. So maybe I could do that in little ways until I can figure it out a little bit more. So I think the internet is one of the catalysts. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Eve, your thoughts?
I would say, to wrap up, to the women, I would say be kinder to yourself and speak up for someone else. So reach out. If someone needs you, you see it, don't wait for them to ask you for help. Reach out to them and be kind to yourself.
I got goosebumps when you said that. My inner child really resonated with that.
Oh.
And Dr. Vanessa, your final thoughts?
Yes, I want to echo the words of Senator Booker to Judge Brown Jackson. You remember that you are worthy. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of understanding. You are worthy of care, of attention, of support. And I would also add to that, like, you are allowed to cry. You are allowed to feel overwhelmed. You are allowed to feel stressed out. You are allowed to feel like you're not doing your best. You are allowed to feel tired. And most important of all, you are allowed to prioritize yourself and take care of yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if I could chime in with my 2 cents, I would say, forgive yourself. Be easy with yourself. Forgive yourself for the times when you didn't know better, when you didn't see where the boundaries and lines were. Forgive yourself for, being just raised in a system where you didn't know differently, because as soon as you know, and maybe today is the time where you really become aware and your eyes are open, and that's okay. But as long as you know, once you reach the point of self-awareness, all things are possible. So if I could add anything, it would be that. And I want to thank all you ladies for being here. I want to thank everyone who is out there watching. I know that we have changed some things. Luigi, who's watching on Facebook, says he is grateful for all of you making the time to share so honestly and thoughtfully with us. And I want to remind everyone that the Haitian Women's Alliance is here for you. Visit us on social media. Check out our website. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. We are there across all social media platforms at the Haitian Women's Alliance. Join us, support us, because we love to have conversations like this. We love to provide real talk and real conversations, real dialogue that change lives, that advances us as a people, as women. And so that's what it's all about, the Haitian Women's Alliance. And I want to thank all of you ladies again for being here. And all of us here, with the exception of Dr. Vanessa as our expert, are board members. So we were all actively involved in this, hands-on, and have made it part of our lives to really pursue this and bring this organization out to women and to help women. So thank you to my fellow board members. Thank you, Dr. Vanessa, for providing all your wonderful expertise. I know you touched some people tonight. So thank you, all of you.
And thank you, Marley. Amazing job, as always. Wonderful.
As always, Marley, thank you so much for bringing this message out.
And thanks to Pat in the background.
Yes.
That's right. Yes. Our fearless leader. Thanks, Pat. And thank you, ladies, again. Have a wonderful night. See you next time. Take care.
Thank you.